We all know what it feels like to be sad or mad or glad, sometimes even a cad, or very, very bad. Similarly, we also know what it's like to be creative. Now, I know some of you may balk at that, but it is true, right? When we are creative, we're most fully ourselves, for we are producing something that is both novel and then also useful in a particular social setting. And you can often feel that kind of magical combination of being unique and playful, productive, and sometimes even have that like transcendent feeling come over you. And this is true whether we are creating anything really, whether that is a short story or an Excel sheet, a painting or a PowerPoint, maybe even a new recipe, right? A new curriculum, or even a new ice cream flavor. The Unitarian process theologian Henry Nelson Wyman understood this power of creativity and even went so far as to associate it with the experience of the divine. Okay, so Wyman defined God as a process, not as a persona, as an experience, not as an entity. And he believed God happened to us and often like in between us. In his mind, God was a verb, not a noun. And every time we engage each other or ideas in a way that creates something new, we are experiencing God, the divine. That's what Wyman posited. And he concluded that it is the thing that drives us to interact creatively, right? It's the urge to kind of bump into each other with new ideas and express ourselves. This experience of creation in the novel is what we were built for, Wyman actually believed. And so no wonder he proclaimed we are most fully human when we create. Now, given that fact, actually, that the creative impulse is both sacred and magical, it's a little confounding why we don't seek it out more often. And why, dear ones, do we do that when we conjure up reasons to not be creative? Well, I think it's complicated, and I kind of want to get on that a little bit. And every now and then I feel like perhaps it's more accurate to say, no wonder we feel most depleted actually when creativity falls just like outside of our reach. So my hope is today that we can explore some ways to pull the creative impulse back into our reach, making it more accessible and regular. Because let's be honest, this creative interchange, as Wyman called it, is truly one of the greatest blessings of being human and is in each and every one of us. So I think many of us would agree, though, that one of the primary reasons we get tripped up around creativity has to do with, like not thinking of ourselves as creative, has to do also with fear and judgment. We may have had an elementary school teacher that told us dogs don't look like pigs or penguins don't look like fire hydrants, right? We might have had a high school English teacher who told us that our metaphors were stale and kind of old. We might have had a camp director that told us that we never are going to be able to act. The world, actually, of art and critique is really big. And I want you to think about all the genres of what we contribute to being like a creative field, right? Like film and theater and dance and art and literature. They all have critics that are involved with that process and then spit out criticism to all of us about whether or not it's worth going to anything, right? Every studio art class I had in college, and my undergrad is in art, and I had about 70 studio art classes and across all kinds of different genres. And the reality is, I don't think ever an assignment came out where you didn't have some kind of critique of the work. And it wasn't the experience of having, your piece and something you're kind of like proud of for doing, or, you had a great technique or you're trying something novel or new. Every time it came down to kind of this analysis or a comment, as in a critique of the work, not of like, hey, that rocks, man, that I love that you just did that. There was always a slicing and dicing of what you had just produced. And I don't know, it's a debilitating, kind of humbling process. Truth is, we've all, though, I do believe this, have experienced somewhere along the line, if it's not from professionals, it also came from our family or our friends or our coworkers, right? And on top of that critique, though, from others, we can also turn inward and wrestle with our own inadequacies or comparisons and then self-judgment to someone else. And we can so easily misunderstand that co-creation with the divine is not ultimately really about leaving some kind of like legacy behind. And it's not about what secures any kind of prestige for us. It's not a means to shore up and validate our self-worth, as if holding some kind of magical power that if we could just be validated through this creative endeavor, the world would be saying to us that we actually matter. And that's kind of crazy when you think about that. I have written in my notes, blah. That's what I think of that. Can you see how dangerous actually that way of thinking about being creative is? It can get us completely devoid of wanting actually to create anything for fear of critique or judgment or admonishment. And I get why people tell themselves, you know what, I'm not creative at all. I'm strictly an analytical person, not an ounce of creativity in me. To which actually I say to that, that's a bunch of hogwash. It just is. You are human, and thus you're living, you're being alive, almost demands that you engage with the creative process. A couple of years ago, the beloved comedian Gary Shandling died at 66. And The Guardian did this wonderful, almost requiem of sorts on his life. And they lifted up the time that Shandling was on this show that's online that Jerry Seinfeld has called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. And this particular show is kind of a portrait of their friendship and affection towards one another. And it starts off by, Gary giving Jerry a big hug and saying, I love you. And Jerry saying, well, I love you back. Now, Shandling in particular was known for being a very empathetic and kind person, which isn't what you normally say about most comedians, but he was thought of that way. So this whole show is the two of them talking while they're in this Porsche driving around. And at one point, Seinfeld mentions the comic David Brenner. And he says, David Brenner passed away last year. And do you ever think about like all that material? And Shandling kind of like laughs and says, I'm at that stage in my life where I actually care about the person. He says, kind of fond and amused all at the same time. But Seinfeld like won't let go of this idea. And he says, but all that material, you work so hard on it. It's just gone. It doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore. And then Shandling replies, that material and your material is purely a way for you to express your spirit and your soul and your being. And then Seinfeld says, it doesn't have any value beyond that. And Shandling says, it doesn't have any value beyond you expressing yourself spiritually in a very soulful, spiritual way. And then he laughs and he looks at Jerry and he says, Jerry, it's why you're on the planet, man. It's why you're on the planet. The creative endeavor, as Shanley says to Jerry, has no value except to express yourself spiritually in a very soulful, unique way to you. It's about expressing, not impressing. I love that. If we looked at creativity in such a manner, we would indeed let go of the need to leave a legacy, to garner prestige, to kind of validate ourselves, right? We would let go of judgments from self and from others because they are irrelevant to the way of thinking about creativity. The truth and lesson of Shanley have to offer is very simple. Creativity, our creativity, is experienced for our well-being, period. That's it. It is our interchange with the divine, our way to be most human, to experience kind of that vastness of the human experience, not to be judged or to judge another, right? Or to be made worthy. But creativity is our way to express ourselves, not impress ourselves or others. So guidepost number 1, right? Here we are. Express, not impress. Many of my artist friends have taught me another thing that keeps creativity just outside of our reach sometimes. And it's our belief that creativity is something that we are. In other words, like we are a creative being or not. Now, on first blush, it may not be such a bad thing to think of creativity as something that we have or are, but it's dangerous. And here I'm going to turn to the ancient world to explain, okay? So the ancient Greeks and the Romans didn't believe that creativity came from a human being. They believed that creativity was a separate divine attendant spirit that came to human beings from some distant and unknowable source for distant and unknowable reasons, right? Okay, so the Greeks famously called these divine attendant spirits daemons. Socrates famously believed that he had a daemon who spoke wisdom to him from afar. And the Romans had the same idea, but they didn't call them daemons. They called the creative spirit a genius. The Romans did not believe that a particularly, how do I say, I missaid that. So they didn't believe that a particular person was creative. They believed that a clever person had a genius. Okay, they believed in these cases a genius like literally lived in the walls of a baker or an artist, and when they needed them, they would come out and help shape the outcome of the work, kind of like the house elf Dobby from Harry Potter. Okay, which is kind of cool, mainly because it gave artists like this psychological construct to protect themselves from the results of their own work. And everyone accepted that is how it functioned, right? In fact, this one author comments on this whole way of thinking about this that I find really interesting. They say, if your work was brilliant, you could take all the credit for it. Everyone knew that you had this disembodied genius who helped you. Likewise, if your work kind of bombed, it wasn't entirely your fault, right? Everyone knew that your genius was kind of lame at the time, or having an off day, or may even be hungover. That is how people thought of creativity in the West. That is until the Renaissance came around, right? Okay, so the Renaissance came around and everything changed. The Renaissance ushered in the beginning of rational humanism. Now, rational humanism put the individual being at the center of the universe above all gods and mysteries, so there wasn't room for such mystical otherness. And for the first time in history, at least in the West, you heard people refer to this or that artist as being a genius, not having a genius. And perhaps in that change is where the big error actually is. It's a little hard to have one person, like one little tiny human being, be the vessel, the essence, the source of all divine, creative, unknowable external mystery. That's a lot for the human psyche to handle. And when the creative inspiration does not embody a creative person, when it seems on strike or on a long vacation or even hungover, when the maddening, somewhat capricious nature of the creative process is intermittent or elusive, what happens now, right? Well, often there's a lot of damning of self, of one's talent and spirit, which in turn makes one's faith in oneself wane. There's a poet, Ruth Stone, who who talks about how a poem would come to her. Okay, she said that when she was growing up in rural Virginia, she would be working in the fields, and she said a poem would come, and she could feel it and hear a poem coming through and over the landscape. And she said it was like this thunderous roar that would come barreling down at her over the landscape, and it would keep coming, right? And it would shake the earth beneath her feet. This is how she talked about it. She knew that she only had one thing to do at that point. When this poem was barreling at her, she had to run like hell to the house to grab a piece of paper and a pencil so she could get the whole poem down. Other times, though, she wasn't fast enough to get back to the house. She'd be running and running and running, and she'd get there and she'd feel the poem, she said, like come through her and out of her. And she talked about that as being, then the poem was off looking for another poet. Then there were times that she was so close, like she's running, she's getting in the house. Poem comes through her and she grabs the poem right at the end and she pulls it back, and she said it would show up on her page backwards from the back of the poem. The end of the poem was at the beginning and it would go backwards on her page. Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of the long-standing New York Times bestseller Eat, Pray, Love, talks about kind of that process, and how this woman, Ruth, talked about how a poem came to her, and she said this: that isn't my process. I am not the pipeline. I'm a mule. And the way I have to work is I get up at the same time every day, and I sweat and I labor and I kind of barrel through it, and it's really awkward. But even I, in my mulishness, have brushed up against that thing at times, ideas that come from this like source that I don't know where, honestly. And what is that thing? How are we to relate to it in a way that will not make us lose our minds, but in fact, keep us sane? And there's the rub, right? The way we think of creativity currently makes it hard to keep sane all the time, because it involves self-criticism and judgment. Because when we are not feeling creative or inspired, we feel betrayed by our creative selves. And that is almost like a suffocating feeling and response. It can and often does debilitate us. So friends, I need to just say, this new way of thinking of creativity just opened up a whole new world to me, one that felt free and expressive and way less harmful to yourself. Tom Waits, the musician, I once heard have this interview on NPR, and it was this great way of explaining almost what I've been talking about, right? So he's saying that he used to have this process of creating a song that was pretty much the embodiment, he said, of the tortured contemporary modern artist trying to control and manage and dominate these sort of uncontrollable creative impulses that were totally internalized. And then he got older and calmer, and one day he's driving down the interstate in LA, and he says everything changed for him. He's speeding along and he hears this little like fragment of a melody, and it comes in as inspiration to him, and it's elusive and it's a tantalizing melody. It's gorgeous and he like longs for it, but he's driving, right? He has no way to get down what's going on, what's coming to him with a piece of paper or a pencil or even a tape recorder. So he starts to feel all that old anxiety raise up in him again. And he's thinking, I'm going to lose this thing and I'll be haunted by this song forever. And I'm not good enough. I can't do it. And instead of panicking though, he just stopped. He just terminated that whole like mental ridiculous process that was happening in his head. And he said he looked up in the sky and he said, "Excuse me, can you not see that I am driving right now? Do I look like I can write a song down? If you really want to exist, come back at a more opportune time. Or go bug Leonard Cohen right now. Leonard Cohen. Go bug him." And his whole work process changed after that. Not the work, he said, was often as dark as it ever was, but the process and that heavy anxiety around it was released when he took the genie, the genius, out of him where it was causing nothing but trouble and released it back to where it came from. You see, he realized this didn't have to be this internalized, tormented thing. It could be this peculiar, kind of wondrous, bizarre collaboration, a kind of conversation between Tom and the strange external thing that was not quite Tom. I love that story. I am much saner when I think of my muse, not in me, but as a brush with something that I can't really quite explain. When conditions are right, I think of the process as being an expansive kind of Midwest field with clover and those little beautiful blue flowers, and there are all these lightning bugs. And I can just go out and catch all of these lightning bugs in that jar. And I feel full and like I've got a gazillion ideas. But sometimes when conditions are okay, I can go out in that field and I can get a few lightning bugs in my jar. And then there are times where I missed the opportunity, right? Like it got too dark, the fireflies aren't around anymore, and they're gone. I waited too long. And I have come to think of those moments as a means to practice like this deep trust that I know that they will return to me when I need them. That I may have lost that one or that group of fireflies, but something else will arrive. Sometimes, too, it comes by the skin of my teeth, but it always comes. I have found this method to not only keep me sane, but it also gives me more freedom to let go and let God, as some people say, which I know sounds strange from a non-theist to say that, but I mean it as simply being open to the creative impulse that any creation I create is not totally of my own doing. I need to tell you that I've been doing an interim now for 2 years, but for the 5 years before that, I took a break from a settled ministry job to interim work, and I did art full time. So my undergrad was in art, and I had a whole business around what I was doing. And I had this friend once say to me, like, "Kaaren, how can you get rid of all these drawings? Like, I don't get it. You just give them away or they sell, and doesn't that like freak you out?" And so I want to just show you like some of the stuff that I do. So this is printed obviously, but I draw with marker on paper, and it's a goofy take on American Gothic, right? Okay, so anyway, this friend was like, I don't know how you do it. And I almost do it as a spiritual discipline now to get rid of as many different pieces of my original art. I have scans of things, right? Or I have, them or copies of them, but I don't need the original. And I do that. I give everything away, or I have sold it, because I need to believe that that creative impulse will come to me when I need it. And it's released me from that like self-tormenting worry and judgment and fear. And when I can have faith in my fireflies, right? I usher in this beauty in my life. And I am connected to something that keeps me grounded and whole and duly joyful. Henry Nelson Wyman, our UU theologian, did not speak of God with a will, intentionality, or a consciousness to it, but rather as a creative exchange, an impulse to share that which is most deeply human with others. Whether that, as I said, short story, Excel sheet, a recipe that you're working on, something with gardening, a PowerPoint, an algorithm, even a new ice cream flavor. And in those creative endeavors, we will have transcendent moments. They may be fleeting or lengthy, but they exist and they delight. So friends, during this month of creativity, may we heed Gary Shandling's wisdom to express, not impress, and the ancients' belief that the creative impulse is ours to interact with as an external friend and muse, as a genius that is out there that will come to us, not us as genius. I do believe, actually, that if we took those on as our tidbits of wisdom, the learned theologian Wyman, if you were still alive, be sitting there amongst all of you with a big smile on his face, and he'd be passing out to all of you pieces of paper and pencil. And he'd tell you to get to it. Explore. Have faith. Unite with that which makes you whole and alive. So carpe diem, my friends, and to all a good night. May it be so. Amen.